The Bolivian people have made their voices heard. Preliminary results show that Luis Arce, a former minister of ousted President Evo Morales, is going to triumph in Sunday's presidential election, or rather has triumphed. An anti-government movement supported by the US toppled Morales last year following a disputed vote.
After nearly 14 years and his recent attempt to override the Bolivian constitution and the will of the people, Morales' departure preserves democracy and paves the way for the Bolivian people to have their voices heard.
The Bolivian people have given a lesson in democracy and perseverance. People have managed to resist the coup, a de facto government, to massacres, an administration of the pandemic marked by inefficiency, corruption, several election postponements, and the worst economic crisis in our history.
Bolivia has, of course, endured over a year of political turmoil. That's all a fallout of the previous contest for the top job being marred by US-backed allegations of fraud. Many Bolivians had simply grown weary of endless protests and shake-ups.
We want to live peacefully, without roadblocks and protests. A new leader for a new Bolivia. We want a president who helps the countryside, the poor people. We don't want any right-wingers.
I feel happy because we want economic stability. We want peace in Bolivia. We want Bolivia to be reflected abroad again as a growing country.
With all the details, here's RT's Maria Finoshna giving the lowdown to my colleague, Andrew Farmer.
This whole election is one big and unfortunately very bitter irony that the Bolivian people paid a very high price for. The winning candidate, Mr. Arce, used to be a finance minister under Morales, so he's from his party, from his team. He's one of his closest people, supporters, and that comes after almost a year of violent turbulence, political repression, and complete nightmare, to be honest, the country has been living in after the previous presidential vote, the one Morales won, was very aggressively and loudly announced as rigged. It was in November, and some studies show that November became the second deadliest month in terms of civilian deaths caused by state forces since Bolivia became a democratic country 40 years ago. So the Organization of American States, known as OAS, was basically leading this whole campaign to blacken last year's elections. After 84% of the votes were counted, there was an unofficial tally saying that Mr. Morales got around 46% of the votes, and he got an 8-point lead. But after all the votes were counted and it was all over, there was an official report finally, and that lead increased to 10.5 points.
The opposition was saying, look, we've seen a sudden spike in favour of Morales right at the end of this election, therefore it was obviously rigged. But there was an explanation why that happened.
There was a very simple explanation. The areas reporting later were more pro-Morales, and this is why when the last 16% of the votes were counted, that lead increased so dramatically. And by the way, that may happen, and we've seen that happening in other countries with similar systems, like United States of America, for example. And America, by the way, was very quick to support the opposition and to welcome what they described as people's fight for justice and democracy.
We salute the courage and strength of the Bolivian people who have protested against a government trying to steal an election. We reject this ridiculous claim that the legal nullification of a fraudulent election is somehow a coup.
All countries deserve free, fair, transparent and credible elections. The Organization of American States report on Bolivia makes it clear that Bolivians were not given this chance. Stop the violence, hold elections and work with Janine Áñez and the transitional government to bring democracy back.
Well, OK, Bolivia seems to have democracy now, but that's not how many people have described the last 12 months.
Human Rights Watch, they issued a report just this September, analyzing, studying the time when the interim government in Bolivia was in charge of the country, and there is a list of violations, many examples of how not good and far from democratic it was. And this is why now Mr. Arce says that after 11 months of this nightmare, people of Bolivia, they know better what the true democracy is.
During last year's elections, some people took to the streets calling for democracy. And now 11 months have passed and we don't have democracy. And even worse, we have a totally destroyed economy. So Bolivian people can now compare the work of our government during 14 years and the so-called work of this interim government.
Bolivia is now coming back to where it was back in October last year, but with so many losses, with destroyed economy, with debts, and the question now, I think, is whether those responsible for pushing the country there will ever respond.
Well, we also spoke to Daniel Shaw, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. In his opinion, he thinks that US-backed forces could still try to overturn the wish of the Bolivian people.
The MAS, the movement towards socialism, never ceased to be popular, but the coup mongers, the neoliberal forces with the support of Pompeo, Trump, the Pentagon, the State Department here in Washington, and the right-wing forces across the continent had the upper hand. This is an amazing victory for the overwhelmingly indigenous, the vast majority of Bolivians who are indigenous, but we should not expect that this political victory translates overnight into an economic victory. The right-wing forces, supported by the U.S., are going to do everything to push back against the MAS, against Arce's victory and the people's victory. So this is going to continue to play out in the course of the next hours, days, months, and years.